This case, this case takes place in Australia and spans over decades. Nicole Patterson was a 28-year-old woman who lived in Melbourne. She had a happy and healthy upbringing. Growing up, her parents stated that she loved people, something that would later reflect in her future career. Nicole excelled academically, becoming a qualified psychotherapist. When she entered her 20s, Nicole realized what she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to help younger people who came from disadvantaged backgrounds and help homeless youth. She set out to become a youth counselor, and her family were incredibly proud of her. Nicole also had other ambitions too. She wanted to start her very own private counseling practice. To find some clients, Nicole placed an advert in a Melbourne newspaper, offering counseling to those suffering from a wide variety of issues in their relationships. The advertisement also made clear that there would be strict confidentiality concerning any disclosures made by her clients to her. This advertisement attracted a rather twisted individual, a man by the name of Peter Dupas. Peter has a long and disturbing past, but we shall get into that a little later on into the video. It's theorized that Peter found a photograph of Nicole, either in a newspaper or online, and from this he became infatuated with her. Peter set about stalking Nicole, learning about her day-to-day life, her routine, and when she would be most vulnerable. Peter would call the number Nicole placed on the advert, chatting to her about the counselling he needed, when in reality, he was gaining information as to when Nicole would be home and when she would be out. Eventually, the two set a counselling session. However, Peter had given a false name and a false number. He gave the name Malcolm. Nicole wrote this name in her diary, along with the date and time of the appointment. Peter also had a girlfriend with whom he lived with, but when she left for work on the 19th of April 1999, he made his way over to Nicole's apartment. Nicole opened the door to Peter, who she believed to be Malcolm. She welcomed him inside and made some coffee for them to drink whilst they conversed. Now, precisely what happened next, or how long Peter stayed in Nicole's home, is unclear. But what is clear is that Peter came with the intent to kill. At some point during the appointment, Peter began to attack Nicole. He struck her again and again in the head. Nicole tried her best to fight back in a sustained and brutal fight. She managed to leave Peter with a number of wounds on his face. However, she wasn't able to fully fend him off. Using a knife, Peter began to stab Nicole. In total, Nicole was stabbed 27 times by Peter in what was a gruesome and frenzied attack. Once Peter had finished stabbing Nicole, he took the blade and cut into her chest. Both of her breasts were completely cut from her body and were taken as some kind of sick trophy. Peter then attempted to scrub the home clean of any potential evidence that could link him to the crime, and then returned home like nothing had happened. Nicole's body would soon be found. The police were called to the crime scene, where an investigation was swiftly launched. It wouldn't take long for the police to find exactly who was responsible. Although Peter had tried to cover his tracks, he did a rather poor job. Despite giving a false name and a false number to Nicole to write down, he phoned her off his own phone. Nicole's phone records were pulled up and given to the police, where they found that a number had contacted Nicole dozens of times over a 40-day period. When investigators contacted the phone provider, they were able to get the information regarding who it belonged to. The number belonged to 46-year-old Peter Dupas. When the police looked into who Peter was, everything made sense. He had a disturbing and vast criminal history, involving acts of SA and violence which extended over approximately 30 years. The police arrested Peter and brought him in for questioning. They right away noticed a large scratch on the side of Peter's face. The police got to work right away. They searched Peter's home where they found a large amount of evidence. A piece of paper was discovered in Peter's bin. It had been torn up, but when investigators pieced it together, the piece of paper had Nicole's details and the time of the appointment written on it. When Nicole's body was discovered, the police realized that she had been bound with electrical tape. When the police searched Peter's home, they discovered that very same tape. A bag containing gloves, a balaclava, condoms, and tape was discovered in Peter's home. A pair of shoes and a jacket were found in Peter's home, both covered in blood and had been disposed of in a bin. And finally, a newspaper was found. The newspaper had a large section cut out of it. The section that was missing was an article about the horrific death of Nicole. So just a couple of days after the murder of Nicole, the police were certain that Peter was responsible. Within hours of his arrest, Peter was charged with the murder of Nicole. Peter was adamant that he was innocent. He told the police that he didn't even know who Nicole was and that they had the wrong man. But DNA evidence would soon conclude that he was lying. The blood found on his shoes and jacket matched Nicole's blood. It was pretty much an open and shut case. But he still continued to deny any wrongdoing. So, who exactly was Peter? Well, the details I'm about to share with you will likely leave you infuriated, as it was clear that Peter was an obvious danger to society and a ticking time bomb. Those who knew Peter in his early years recall that he wasn't very popular in school. He was shorter than others and was overweight. These two things resulted in him being singled out. They recalled Peter being an unhappy person. He would often be bullied and teased, and he had very few friends. He was also held back a year at school, as he was described as a slow learner. He wasn't a very intelligent individual, and many of his peers picked up on this. When Peter was in his teens, he would often watch people through their windows and would steal their underwear. He did this undetected. However, people in his neighborhood would often notice their undergarments going missing off the washing line. But Peter's reign of violence wouldn't begin until he was 15. In 1968, still dressed in his school uniform, Peter went to the house of a young mother in his neighborhood and knocked on the door. The woman answered, and Peter, innocently standing there, asked the woman if he could please borrow a sharp knife. He explained that his family's knife had broken and they needed to chop some vegetables. The woman thought absolutely nothing of this. She told Peter to wait right there while she went inside to fetch him a knife. As soon as Peter was given the knife, he began violently slashing his neighbor and tried to stab her. The woman did her best to protect herself and her family. She grabbed the blade, resulting in her hands being badly cut. She was, however, able to stop any fatal injuries. She pleaded with Peter, telling him to stop, but he just replied, "I need to finish this." The woman successfully saved herself, and when Peter finally stopped, he began to cry. The police were called, and Peter was arrested. He told the police that he couldn't help himself, and he didn't know why he was trying to kill the woman. Peter was put on probation and given psychiatric treatment. He was also observed by professionals in a psychiatric hospital. However, Peter had a skill in deceiving people. He would later be described as a Jekyll and Hyde character. The staff in the psychiatric hospital that observed Peter found him to be a model patient. They described him as incredibly caring and thoughtful, but this was all part of Peter's plan. After 2 weeks, he was released and went back into the very neighborhood where he had attacked the woman. The feeling of power that Peter had in those moments during the attack and the injuries he inflicted upon the woman gave him a deep sense of satisfaction. On the 5th of November 1973, Peter struck again. At the age of 21, Peter knocked on the door of a woman whom he didn't know. The woman answered, and Peter explained that his car had broken down, and he asked the woman if he could borrow her screwdriver. This was a lie. His car was perfectly fine. The woman told Peter that she would go into her house to see if she could find one, but as she did this, Peter lunged into the home and forced himself upon the woman. He then fled from the scene, and soon after, the woman contacted the police and reported the attack. She gave a description of Peter and of his car. Only days later, Peter would try this again. He knocked on the door of a woman and said that his car had broken down and that he needed to use her phone. However, this woman became suspicious of Peter. She told him her husband would be home in a couple of minutes and that if he waited, her husband would be able to fix the car no problem. This seemed to spook Peter. He turned around, got into his car, and drove away. The woman was able to write down Peter's number plates. She reported the incident to the police, who ran the plates through their system, and a familiar name popped up: Peter. Peter was questioned about the attack on the woman, and he denied all the wrongdoing. Although this wouldn't matter, as the woman was able to identify Peter in a lineup. For this, Peter was charged with SA and was later found guilty in court. He was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment with a minimum term of 5 years. The sentencing judge described it as one of the worst cases of SA that could ever be imagined. Peter was released on parole on the 4th of September 1979. Very shortly after this release, Peter struck again in a very similar manner. On the 2nd of June 1980, Peter was convicted again of SA. This time he was sentenced to be imprisoned for a period of 6.5 years with a minimum term of 5. Peter was again released on the 27th of February 1985, and frustratingly, yet again, very shortly after his release, he offended in the same way. On the 3rd of June 1985, he was convicted of aggravated SA and was sentenced to 12 years with a minimum term of 10. It was clear that prison was absolutely no deterrent for Peter. While imprisoned during this sentence, Peter began a relationship with a mental health nurse named Grace. Grace was 16 years older than him, and the pair married in 1987 whilst Peter was serving his sentence. Despite a 10-year minimum sentence, Peter was released in March of 1992 after serving only 7 years, a true injustice to his victims. When Peter was released, he lived with his wife Grace in Melbourne. This time, there was a gap of almost 2 years following the offence, where Peter wasn't caught for any crimes. But on the 3rd of January 1994, a lady was picnicking with her friends at Lake Eppock. At around 11:30 AM, she left her friends and walked 150 metres to a public toilet block. She entered the cubicle and removed her shorts and sat there. As she was getting up, Peter entered the cubicle, forcing the door open and wielding a knife. Peter was wearing a balaclava, and he held the knife towards her face. This woman attempted to fend off the knife and sustained a number of injuries to her hands. Peter kept telling her to turn around, but she resisted. The woman was able to flee, and Peter began driving away, but this woman, in a frantic state, ran back to her friends and told them what had just happened. Upon hearing this, these brave friends decided to take action. They knew that Peter was armed with a knife, but despite this, they chased him in his car, caught him, and restrained him until the police arrived. When the police came, Peter was arrested. When they searched his pockets, they found tape and a pair of metal handcuffs. It became very obvious what Peter's intentions were. The woman suffered extreme trauma from this attack. She required constant counselling for months. She suffered nightmares and showed signs of PTSD. She required sedatives for sleeping and struggled to go anywhere alone. Despite this, Peter was only sentenced to 3 years and 9 months imprisonment, with a minimum term of 2 years and 9 months. Upon being found guilty, Peter's wife Grace filed for a divorce, and the two never saw each other again. In September of 1996, Peter was again released. This time he moved to an area of Melbourne where people didn't know about his twisted past. He made some friends and found a girlfriend, doing his best to blend in. Peter would come to the police's attention again in April of 1999, when he killed and mutilated Nicole. Peter was found guilty of the murder of Nicole, and due to the twisted nature of the crime combined with Peter's extensive criminal record, the judge stated that the only appropriate punishment would be life in prison, without the possibility of parole. When speaking about the case, the judge said, "In my opinion, you regarded Nicole Patterson as nothing more than prey to be entrapped and killed. There is no indication whatsoever that you have experienced any sense of remorse for what you have done, and I doubt that you are even capable of such human response. At a fundamental level, as human beings, you present us the awful, threatening, and unanswerable question, how did you become as you are? Peter attempted to appeal his sentence shortly after, thankfully with no success. However, even to this day, Nicole's severed breasts and the knife used in the attack have never been found. The police began to wonder if any other unsolved murders could be linked to Peter. Many investigators didn't believe that this was his first kill, and they were right. Peter was in fact a serial killer. There was strong evidence to suggest that Peter was responsible for the unsolved murder of 40-year-old Margaret Mayer. Margaret was a street worker whose body was discovered under a cardboard box on the 4th of October 1997. Margaret had suffered a great deal. She had been struck repeatedly in the head, causing serious blunt force trauma. She had also been choked, causing serious damage to her neck. She had cuts all over her body, and both of her breasts had been removed, just like what had happened to Nicole. Only on this occasion, Peter had placed Margaret's breasts into her mouth. Serial killers usually have a sort of signature. For Peter, he would mutilate a woman's breasts or thighs. This was enough to arouse suspicion that Peter was responsible for this murder too, as at the time he was out of prison and was no longer under supervision. DNA evidence from the crime scene was cross-referenced with Peter's DNA. The DNA evidence linked him to the crime. A new trial would be held for the murder of Margaret. The jury were not told of Peter's previous convictions. Not even the murder of Nicole was mentioned. The evidence was presented to the court, and Peter was found guilty of the murder of Margaret. Following the conclusion of the trial, Nicole's sister described Peter as an evil psychopath, as she realized that her sister was not the only victim. And then there was the murder of 25-year-old Mersina Halvagis. Mersina was murdered in a brutal attack on the 1st of November 1997. Again, this case was unsolved. Mersina had gone to the cemetery by herself to visit her grandmother's grave. At around 3:45 p.m. on the 1st of November, Mersina bought some flowers from the cemetery tea rooms and drove her car to the northern section of the grounds near the Greek Orthodox section. She walked to her grandmother's grave, plot M33. She placed the flowers on the grave, and at this point, Mersina likely began talking to her grandmother's grave and said a silent prayer. She didn't see or hear Peter approaching. Peter attacked Mersina from behind, likely picking her out due to her small size. She only weighed 45 kilograms and was 155 centimeters tall. Peter would often frequent a pub just across the road, and he likely saw her as she arrived. Mersina suffered 87 stab wounds, mostly to her breasts. The police were able to link Peter to the crime in 2002, when a fellow inmate of Peter confessed that Peter had told him about the murder. This prisoner and Peter were doing some gardening together in 2002. The prisoner found what appeared to be a knife. The prisoner shouted Peter to come over and told him to inspect the knife. This prisoner would later say, "I found a homemade knife and called Peter over to show it to him. He took it off me and started handling it, almost caressing it in a sexual way. Peter then started saying, 'Mersina, Mersina,' over and over again with a strange look on his face. Following this, the prisoner and Peter began talking, and Peter confessed to the murder. The prisoner then told the police everything he knew. The police questioned Peter, but he denied any involvement. However, a trial would soon take place. The prisoner who told the police about Peter's confession testified against him in court, and a number of key witnesses also came forward who recalled seeing Peter at the cemetery at the time of the murder. The family of Mersina also firmly believe that Peter is responsible for her death. On the 9th of August 2007, Peter was found guilty of the murder of Mersina. He was sentenced to his third life sentence with no minimum term. However, Peter successfully appealed his sentence and he got himself a new trial. But thankfully, he was again found guilty of the murder and his sentence was reinstated. 3 life sentences.
Well, Ron, Peter Dupas murdered 25-year-old Messina Vargas at Melbourne's Faulkner Cemetery 13 years ago. She was there to tend to her grandmother's grave and is actually believed to have been kneeling in front of her grandmother's plot praying when Dupas struck from behind, stabbing her more than 30 times. A judge once described Dupas as a psychopath driven by a hatred of women. In many ways, today isn't really even about Peter Dupas, it's about the Vargas family and giving them the chance to see the man who cruelly snatched away the life of a much-loved daughter and sister finally punished for his crime.
Peter has 3 confirmed kills: Nicole, Margaret, and Messina. However, the true number of victims is believed to be even higher. The police believe he killed 3 more people. In the early hours of New Year's Eve 1997, 95-year-old Kathleen Downs was murdered in her room in a Brunswick care home for the elderly. Mrs. Downs was stabbed in the neck and her throat was sliced. The killer was able to sneak in and out undetected. But there is evidence that Peter made a number of calls to the care home in November of 1997 under the alias William Johnston on the pretense of making an appointment to view a room for his elderly mother. Peter also told a fellow prisoner about the murder, bragging about how he left no forensic evidence behind with the old Sheila. He even told the prisoner the name of the woman he killed, Mrs. Downs. Peter was charged with the murder of Mrs. Downs in 2018, but the case hit a wall when the prisoner who would be testifying against him in court discovered that he had cancer. Medical professionals have said he wouldn't be able to withstand cross-examination in the trial. He is also a suspect in the murder of 31-year-old Renita Brunton. Renita had been stabbed over 100 times in a disturbing frenzy, mainly to her breasts and thighs. And finally, Peter is suspected of also killing 47-year-old Helen McMahon. This is believed to be his very first victim. On the 13th of February 1985, Helen was sunbathing on a beach when she was attacked. Her body was discovered naked and covered with a beach towel. Officially, these 3 murders remain unsolved, but it's likely that Peter is responsible for these crimes. The police who worked on the numerous cases involving Peter believe that he is guilty of these crimes, and they hope that one day they will be able to prove without a shadow of a doubt that he is guilty, so they can finally bring some closure to the victims' families. Peter Dupas is considered to be one of the very worst criminals in Australian history, yet for some reason, he is relatively unknown outside of Australia. When I lived in Australia, I would often speak to Australian people about true crime in the country. Many people mentioned Peter as one of the very worst, along with Martin Bryant and Ivan Milat. The case of Peter is truly terrifying. He is a relentless psychopathic criminal who can never be trusted. So many people who knew Peter in real life or those who cared for him in prison have stated that his ability to appear friendly and docile is scary, referring to him as a real-life Jekyll and Hyde. In fact, the prison staff describe him as a model prisoner whilst in custody, and a monster whenever he is released. Thankfully, Peter will remain behind bars for the rest of his life, as there is no doubt that if Peter ever was to be released, he wouldn't be able to stop himself. It would only be a matter of weeks before he would strike again.